Welcome to Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis, a series of casual conversations on the most important events in the MENA region today. I'm Brian Katulis, MEI's Vice President of Policy, and today I'm joined by Ben Samuels, the U.S. correspondent for Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper. Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
First, let's start off, Ben. What's your origin story? How'd you get into this line of work? What motivated you? And what advice do you have for people who want to do what you're doing in your career?
You know, it's interesting because I think of my work first and foremost in terms of dealing with Israel and Palestine and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict rather than journalism. So, you know, I grew up in a very sort of by-the-book Jewish establishment household, went to a Jewish day school, went to a Zionist summer camp, very involved in Jewish campus life in college. And, you know, I always had a, let's say, healthy amount of skepticism in terms of the narrative around Israel and the conflict that you're taught with in that. But you know, when you grow up in that world, the scope of what you're taught is very narrow. And I studied the conflict in college. I studied political science in the greater Middle East, and I knew I wanted to work with it somehow after I graduated. So in 2013, I enrolled in Tel Aviv University for a master's program, and I knew I wanted to get my feet on the ground some way, somehow, whether that was working for a think tank, an NGO, and journalism. And in my mind, Haaretz has always been the gold standard for journalism in Israel. And, you know, it helps also that they have an English and a Hebrew edition. And, you know, I landed and I kind of hounded the editor-in-chief at the time, you know, just
Who was that?
Charlotte Hale.
Okay. And just to tell our listeners, Haaretz has been around for how long? It's
the oldest daily in Israel. It's been around since 1919, so
Wow.
predating the state of Israel by several decades. The English edition is much more recent. That's been around since the early 2000s, the late 90s, I think, something in that range.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it is really very much the paper of record in Israel. It is considered, you know, kind of, it speaks truth to power on the ground there in Hebrew, but also it is sort of the international community's gateway into what's happening in Israel in real time, you know, in halls of power throughout America, the Middle East, Europe. Haaretz is sort of considered the voice of liberal ideology, let's say.
And when you went out there for school, did you speak Hebrew?
I did, yeah.
Okay.
So I learned it growing up, but, you know, obviously, as most people can attest to that speak a second language, you can only really become so fluent until you actually live there. So, you know, I thought I spoke fluent Hebrew, but then I realized that I knew enough to realize how not fluent I was.
Yeah. So your advice in short is to get out to these countries, learn the language, figure out where it is you might want to work. And you got your foot in the door how?
So I asked for a job repeatedly. You know, I was like, I'm 22 years old. I have zero professional experience.
Yeah.
How about a job? And, you know, fortunately, my hubris and just total arrogance of what it actually takes to get a job led me to get a job. And I started as a part-time proofreader.
What year was that?
This was late 2013.
Okay.
So part-time proofreader turned into full-time proofreader. And then a war broke out. It was the 2014 Gaza war.
Right.
And they just needed bodies on the desk because, you know, it's a 24-hour news desk, but those 24 hours are a lot longer when there's a war going on.
Yeah.
So I started working as an editor on the desk. I ended up joining the desk full time, ended up staying there for several more years, rising up to the head of the news desk. And then eventually in 2020, right after the election, when I moved back to the States, I became their U.S. correspondent.
Great. So you've been at it for 10 years there, more or less. How has it changed? How has not only the newspaper, but the media environment in Israel changed in that 10 years since you've been reporting?
Yeah, I mean, Israel has definitely taken a very decided shift to the right. And, you know, I moved there when the Obama peace efforts were still going on.
Right.
Then I was there when Trump was elected and everything that wrought. And then I came back for the Biden administration. And as America has sort of been fluctuating, Israel's just been on a very steady path continuing to the right. And
that's in the media as well. There's new outlets and things like that.
There's new outlets. There's, just like in America, there's sort of a war on truth and facts and fake news and however you want to call it. And there is an undeniable chilling effect against freedom of speech, against protest, against media such as Haaretz, but also just sort of anyone that tries to voice any sort of level of dissent. You know, there is a genuine, real effort to suppress that going on.
Wow. So we're going to have a conversation and try to make it a conversation where Ben and I met. I think you may have interviewed me or we've had lunches. You may have quoted me, but You can ask me questions. I'm going to ask you some questions. We'll talk on different topics. So what's your take? Here we are, almost the middle of 2023, on the current state of relations between the U.S. and Israel. We now have a somewhat newish Netanyahu government, the latest iteration. We have a Biden team that's been in there 2.5 years almost. Where are relations right now? How do you see it?
It's interesting because I think there's a tendency on both sides of the spectrum to either completely overstate it, like there has never been a lower moment in U.S.-Israel relations.
Yeah.
And then there's also a tendency to be like, things have never been better. Military aid is going uninterrupted. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. There's no shortage of analysis on this question, right?
It's a growth industry.
Yeah.
But it's funny because Joe Biden, there's no denying that he is a lover of the state of Israel. He is surrounded by people who also share very similar, like, traditional Zionist ideology.
Yeah.
That view is becoming a little bit less in vogue in the Democratic Party.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's safe to say that there's not going to be as pro-Israel of a Democratic president as Joe Biden after Joe Biden.
Yeah.
You know, the trends just are not going that way. So in terms of the Biden administration's relations with Israel and with this Netanyahu government specifically, the thing that's most front of mind is trying to preserve any semblance of what a two-state solution may be.
Uh-huh.
And that's completely antithetical to the current Israeli government's goals, whose primary goal is annexing the West Bank,
right,
and absolutely destroying any possibility of a two-state solution.
Uh-huh.
So it's very hard to square the circle there. You can talk about bipartisan support. You can talk about unshakable bonds. You can talk about whatever you want. But at the end of the day, the current president of the United States and the current prime minister of the state of Israel have absolutely diverging opinions on what the path forward looks like.
So Biden clearly states he's in favor of a two-state solution. Netanyahu, I think, gave a speech maybe 15 years ago saying he was in favor of it. But I think your assessment and the assessment of many is that the configuration of his current cabinet is absolutely not in favor of that. They don't state clearly what it is they want in terms of an end state. They talk about next steps, including annexation as a goal. So we're in this tenuous dance between these two leaders right now. And what's your assessment? There are leaders that are probably going to have to deal with each other for the next year or two, or we just don't know given what's going on inside of Israel's politics?
I mean, you never know with Israeli coalitions and governments. You know, there was a budget crisis last month that looked like the end of it. There could be the downfall of the government based off negotiations around the judicial overhaul, which is a whole nother can of worms. That is a huge issue between the Biden administration and Netanyahu's government. So there's no shortage of crises that are on the immediate horizon and that can arise before the 2024 election.
Right.
That being said, let's just operate with the assumption that Netanyahu and Biden are going to be in power until the 24 presidential election. So they have to deal with each other and they have to both be directly engaged with each other, not least of which is because of Iran, which I'm sure you should probably speak to in terms of the Saudi element of it all with ongoing normalization,
right,
how that fits together,
yeah,
what Biden is hoping to get out of that, whether or not that's a true priority of the Biden administration. So I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I think first, when Naftali Bennett was the prime minister, and even before he was in office, I think there's been a current sort of consistent strand in the Biden team's approach to Israel, which is different than what Obama did. And they really have tried to hold all of the advisors pretty close. There's been, not that there wasn't this consultation under Trump or Obama, but a very decided effort of, if not no daylight, they're trying to make sure that there are no surprises. I think they had in the Bennett government more of a willing partner in that. I think there's despite Biden's views, his personal views and the people around him about Israel, I think there's just a trust and confidence gap that exists right now on a number of issues. And it's not just because of Netanyahu and the legacy that goes back to the 90s with some people in the Clinton administration. Like, this is a deep legacy where this man was not seen as trustworthy by a lot of people who want and do support Israel, right? So on these questions right now, I think we're in a really dicey period where I think the team is still trying to coordinate closely. We constantly send out CENTCOM commander. We started the year, in essence, sending out the CIA director, Secretary of State, and Jake Sullivan, and constantly trying to sort of be on this relationship closely. But I don't want to speak for them, but I suspect there's just a lingering concern that, the unpredictability of what this current Israeli government could do, and in some ways has already done on the ground, and how do you actually shape that? How do you lead it to a particular outcomes? That's why, I want to turn it back to you a little bit, but on the Iran question, it's clear that the nuclear program is progressing in ways that are concerning to Americans, to Israelis, to Gulf partners. But I don't see a plan B that's actually been worked out and discussed in terms of what to do. People talk about different things. There was a big military exercise at the start of this year between the US and Israel. But when it comes to a strategy, I don't actually see a clear plan B worked out first by the Biden team, but then second, and I think it's important, in concert with our closest partners, including Israel and some in the Gulf. And that's a dangerous situation right now. And that's just on the nuclear question. You add to it, notwithstanding the China deal in March between Iran and Saudi Arabia, if you look underneath the hood, there's not as yet a lot of there. There's talk about trust and confidence gaps. Iranian attacks across the region, the shipments of weapons continue, right? So we're in this period where I fear we're sleepwalking into something that is much more complicated than what some people on the left here in America feared under Trump, which was another war in the Middle East and going after Iran. I think it's the inadvertent slip into something that's much more dangerous, where we're not coordinated with our closest partners. Because there are real threats out there. There are threats in Syria. We see it every day. There are threats coming from Lebanon to Israel, but then also to U.S. soldiers in Iraq. But what I worry about is at the strategic level, not at the tactical or operational level. We don't have an agreed upon plan. And that's not a political issue. That's more of a policy issue. But the politics, I think, complicate it in both countries.
And it's funny because the photo inverse of that in terms of the conversation in Israel is also to that end, because everyone is just so excited about the potential of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And you're seeing news reports every day about how it's around the corner, and Bibi and Mohammed bin Salman are having conversations twice a day or whatever it is.
Right.
People are really getting ahead of themselves. And Barbara Leaf, the top diplomat dealing with the Middle East in the State Department, she said during a recent congressional hearing that I think her words were a lot of excitable rumment.
Right.
And she said there's a lot of hyperventilating going on, especially among the Israeli press about this. And, Secretary Blinken is in Saudi Arabia right now. Yeah. He addressed potential normalization for the first time since being over there, saying it's obviously something the administration wants to advance. But his Saudi counterpart said, obviously, this would be a good thing, but the benefits of it are completely watered down by the lack of a two-state solution.
Yeah, that's their bottom line. This is the thing when some think tank delegations come back from trips to Saudi Arabia and they have their own particular view on this and they're more hopeful about normalization, they often ignore that part. The thing that has been the consistent Saudi position since essentially 2002, which is the Arab Peace Initiative. And they've reintroduced it at different events. They haven't sold it very well, but I think that's clearly their line. And when people ask me this question, I travel across the region, including to Saudi Arabia, pretty regularly, talk to officials, talk to academics. Right now, the math doesn't add up to me, right? Saudi Arabia is a much bigger country and sees itself as the custodian of the two holy mosques and sees Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, I think, is a big part of the equation because it's sacred to Muslims as well as Christians and Jews as well. And it's that plus the lack of progress on the Palestinian front. Not that today's Saudi leaders care that much in the way that previous generations did about the current Palestinian leadership. I just think the math doesn't add up. It doesn't seem clear to me that if the Saudis were not willing to enter into the Abraham Accords and normalization at the end of the Trump era, and I know the Trump folks were trying to get them feverishly into that deal, I don't see them doing that under the Biden administration, given how rocky the relations have been and despite the recent efforts to smooth that over. Similarly, as we were talking before about we'll go back to the U.S.-Israel relationship, I don't see the Biden team trying to give a big win to Netanyahu at this point. But I do think that it's true that they'd like to see this as an ideal, normalized relations with regional integration. I actually think it would be a good thing. But these agreements cannot be built like a settlement road in the West Bank that goes around the Palestinians. It's got to include them in some sort of way. And that's, I think, the kicker is that the Palestinian piece of the equation is also complicated because of not only their leadership, but the divisions in their own polity.
Well, I actually disagree with you on one point there, because I do think the Biden administration is pretty keen on making this happen, especially before the 2024 election.
Yeah.
Because Israel is going to be a point that Republicans hit Democrats with,
Right.
no matter what happens over the next year.
Yeah.
Tom Nides, the current ambassador, he's leaving in the middle of the summer. There's a whole debate about whether or not Biden is going to try to appoint an ambassador. And if he tries, good luck getting that through a Senate confirmation hearing.
Right.
A U.S. administration official told me that any potential Senate confirmation hearing is going to be a shit show.
Right.
Their words, not mine. But the thing is, if you don't appoint an ambassador and you just have a charge d'affaires over there, that's not going to have the voice and the gravitas of a presidential appointed ambassador.
Right.
And you need that to engage with this far right Israeli government that is looking to stick a finger in the eye of this Democratic administration, no matter what they do. So Biden has really been trying to not only build upon the Abraham Accords normalization, but to bring more countries in. And Saudi Arabia would be the crown jewel in that. And if he brings Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords and he achieves normalization, that is an automatic negation of any attack that Republicans try to give Biden, that he is not a full-throated supporter of Israel.
That's a great point. I guess our difference of views is based on the fact that I don't see how the math adds up if you don't include the Palestinians. If you understand that the Saudi position, as the Saudi foreign minister clearly stated, involves a two-state solution conception. What you said earlier is you've got an Israeli government that won't take you there. They're constituted in such a way that have voices that just don't agree with that, and they want something different. We'll see what Biden does on this. I suspect they'll probably take a pass on the ambassador nominee, but may try to appoint someone who plays a role on these issues. And what I suspect they'll do is try to build the scaffolding for, conversations that are already happening, the Negev summit follow-up, and other things, and things that are quite good, but also kind of tactical and trying to build on the relations between those countries that have normalization agreements. Back to the U.S.-Israel relationship. On Iran, where do you see, I said the view that I don't think the U.S. has mapped out a plan B yet. And they said that a deal is not likely in the offing, but there's nothing to replace it. Where does Bibi go with this? And what are Israelis thinking about Iran and the threat that it presents right now?
So the talking point from both the administration and the Israelis, by strictly in terms of the language, it sounds the same. They're saying all options are on the table. I think if you ask Israelis what all options are on the table means compared to what the Americans are saying, I think it's a very different glass half full versus glass half empty sort of reading of that. And do the Israelis actually want to take a military strike on Iran? Do they have the capabilities to do it? Do they have the backing of the Americans to actually do it, despite what the Americans are saying? I don't know. I truly do not know. But that is part of the reason that there is this urgency on the Americans' part to not let the Israeli government drift too far away. Two of Netanyahu's most senior advisors were here for very candid conversations in recent weeks.
Right.
And the Saudi efforts to bring them into the fold are very real. And these have very real implications on what diplomacy with Iran may look like and what military action against Iran may look like.
Right.
So, they're working from the same general point of view, but how to actually achieve those end goals are just completely disengaged from each other.
Yeah, and that's where I say it's a very dangerous situation right now. We wrote recently in a report we put out a couple of weeks ago about the possibilities of de-escalation across the region. And I think there's a really interesting dynamic right now where I've heard in the Gulf and other Arab countries, 2023 is not 2013 or 14. Our appetite for kinetic action against Iran wasn't what it was, in part for two reasons. One, we've built up our countries quite a lot in that period, and we've created a lot of things on the ground, and we're in the crosshairs. If someone takes a hit at Iran, we already know that they're going to come after us. So that's one, and I think that gives them a lot of hesitation. The second is they've been hit repeatedly over the last couple of years, including, people forget, under the Trump administration, Abqaiq, the largest attack on an oil facility ever by Iran against Saudi Arabia. Nothing was done as a result. And the impact of being hit and then also feeling like you're sort of on your own puts you in a situation that I think motivated these countries, UAE and Saudi in particular. Oman and Qatar always had kept an open line, with Iran motivated them to enter into these talks in Iraq and Oman and other places. None of them think it's going to actually solve the essential problem. They read it as they see it, which is you've got a regime that's still revolutionary in its mindset, expansionist, still supports groups across the region from Hezbollah and others. But we need to talk to them to try to keep it cool, right? And go back to the point I was trying to stay. You come in with sort of bellicose rhetoric from Israel, a new prime minister, and say, we're going to, look at military action. I think the private conversation is like, whoa, wait a second. We're not with you there. And the thing that I think frustrates me the most is that this opening, there's less room for creativity right now in how we think about things for diplomacy, about new pathways for diplomacy. Because my reaction to the China deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia is, okay, Biden team sort of said this too. Let's see what it produces, right?
Yeah.
And if it really produces tangible commitments that improves the security of countries in the Gulf, then could you extend that to other countries across the region? I see no discussion of that inside of Israel at all. I mean, except in some academic circles and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, the conversation in Israel is much more essentialized. Just like most conversations in Israel, it kind of tends to lack nuance a little bit. But, something that you hear a lot in Israel is that the Biden team is not the Obama team, and Biden is not Obama. So
what do they mean by that?
They mean that they viewed Obama and his administration and his advisors and the team around him as inherently antagonistic to Israel. They do not hold that view of most of the officials in the Biden administration, save a few people in the State Department.
But does that view, what's your prediction? Will that lead them to not engage in trying to make this a partisan wedge issue, the U.S.-Israel relationship in 2024? Do you think Bibi's going to get an invite from the Speaker, Kevin McCarthy? The sorts of things that we saw under Obama, which sort of shocked me, the very obvious attempts to make this a partisan issue rather than a bipartisan one. Emergency Committee for Israel formed by people on the right because they thought Obama, I think, misread Obama in my view and what he was willing to do. Do you think that difference of views will lead to restraint? I mean, when you look at sort of our politics and not only Trump, but Ron DeSantis and others, or is there a weird symbiotic relationship on the right that just inevitably makes this a partisan wedge issue?
Both, maybe. I mean, I think Netanyahu will not think twice about completely going against the Biden administration's wishes if it's good for him, not if it's good for the state of Israel, if it's good for him.
That's a key point.
I mean, obviously, his worldview of what will guarantee the security of the state of Israel is a big factor in that. Not saying that, but at the end of the day, he is more self-interested than any of the players on the stage that we are currently talking about.
It's very Middle Eastern ruler of him, actually.
He's a creature of the neighborhood, I guess.
When you think of it. All right, so we talked quite a lot about the policy stuff and the Biden administration and got a little bit into the politics. But let's talk first about how you think the politics inside of America has changed about U.S.-Israel. You've been at Haaretz for about a decade or so, tracking this from over there, and now here as the U.S. correspondent. What's fundamentally shifted both in the Republican Party and then in the Democratic Party, and then how that interacts?
So first with the Republican Party, I think, it is very much taking their cues from Netanyahu. And the conversation within that party has become a lot more essentialized and a lot more black and white. And it is, you either support Israel or you're an anti-Semite. And that is basically the range of opinions within the Republican Party. Within the Democratic Party, the center of gravity is shifting a lot further left, the further that Israel moves to the right. So there's a tendency for people to, especially progressives, to talk about this sea change of progressive opinion taking over the Democratic Party. And this is the next session of Congress where Israel will lack that sort of bipartisan foundational support. And I think that gets overstated a little bit. I'm sure your time in progressive circles, you can attest to that as well.
Right, yeah.
But there is no doubt that Israel's standing within the Democratic Party has taken a real hit over the past 10, 20 years.
Yes. So, I mean, how's it changed tangibly in terms of votes? Like, how does it compare to previous eras when you'd have a lone congressman sort of lift up his or her voice versus now? I'll give you my views on it because I do think there is a shift, but I think it's overstated. It's in some ways people projecting their wishes and hopes on something that hasn't yet come to fruition, but also doesn't matter as much in the grander scheme of what's at play in our politics today. But how do you think it's shifted in terms of tangible votes?
Well, listen, I don't think there's any doubt that they're not going to be able to overturn military aid to Israel. They're not going to be able to pass legislation that tangibly changes facts on the ground.
Yeah.
But the real litmus test is how it does compare to the previous iteration of certain bills or certain past Congresses or certain letters that use the same language. So Betty McCollum's bill talking about State Department reporting is like the prime example of that. You know, this year's session of Congress, that version of the bill had more original co-sponsors than last year's.
Yeah.
So that's considered a win. Is it going to pass? 0.000% chance. Does that matter? Not necessarily in terms of the optics of it all. And not only that, but you know, there's a whole nother conversation to be had about the electability of progressives around the country. But progressives are, by and large, getting more of a foothold within the Democratic Party at all levels. And the more that younger generations rise up through party ranks, the more that Israel drifts further rightward, the more that Israel institutes policies that are completely antithetical to the core of the Democratic Party, the harder it's going to be for that center to hold of pro-Israel Democrats. And you're really starting to see a real divide between the future of the party. Does that mean that the divide is manifesting right now? Not really, but it's not a hard no.
The votes aren't there. They're more than they were in the past, but they're not where they were 15, 20 years ago, or even a few years ago. I mean, look, I think my view and my concern, and I worked a lot on this and lived in Ramallah and the Gaza Strip in the 90s and have a deep personal connection to Palestinians. And my concern in this whole debate is that there's this, people know more what they're against as opposed to what they're clearly in favor of, and clearly in favor of something that can be achieved. And the big gap that I see in our political debate back here is that some of the voices, not all, but some of the voices who call themselves pro-Palestinian quite often don't include Palestinian perspectives in that view, quite often don't have proposals that try to lift up the people of Palestine and what they're dealing with, because they're dealing with, yes, an Israeli occupation, but they're also dealing with, in the West Bank, a pretty corrupt autocratic system. In the Gaza Strip, something fundamentally different. And the sort of texture that is required and the depth to really explain the nuances of all of this in a context of our current political divides in America, it's really hard to punch through. And my bigger worry is that some of the voices who are sort of raging against something, right, and against older structures that may not be advancing U.S. interests or values in the right way, but they're not lifting up those voices, and I know many of them and why I feel connected to them, the next generation of Palestinians who I think can provide something different and offer something different from their future. And that's not even part of the conversation. And we have a simple fact that the Trump team shut down a lot of things, including aid, a consulate, just basic relations and connections between Americans and Palestinians. And my colleague here at MEI, Khaled Al-Gindi, wrote a book and talks a lot about this, about how the U.S.-Palestinian relationship is just viewed as subsidiary to the U.S.-Israel relationship. And I'm of the view that it's important for the U.S., for its own interests and values, to strengthen the relations with Palestinians and what I hope would be, an independent state, while also simultaneously building constructive relationships with Israel, though that becomes more complicated. Israel has its challenges with its democracy too. So,
there's a really interesting point there, because something that gets lost in the conversation about Trump and the team around him was, I think the way that we talk about Trump in hindsight was that, he was belligerent. All of his officials was a total mess for 4 years. In terms of Trump's efforts with Israel and the Palestinians, it was very calculated. It was very well thought out. It was done by people that knew exactly what they were doing. And the Biden administration has had an extremely difficult time walking those things back and putting it back on track to the way they want it to be. They've reinstituted aid to the Palestinians. They've had a lot of difficulty doing that, but they've done it. They haven't been able to reopen the consulate in East Jerusalem.
Right.
And that was something that was supposed to be within the first 100 days of the administration that they were going to do it. But not only did Israel effectively veto it, but they did not have the political capital to get it done within Washington.
Right.
So I think the consulate itself is just such a prime example of the roadblocks that Biden has run into that were put in place by Trump.
So, and I mean, I want to ask you more on the politics, but you go back to the policy discussion we were having. If you agree with my argument that the Palestinians necessarily have to be part of a sustainable regional solution that includes the Saudis, you heard what Prince Faisal bin Farhan just said, but the U.S. cannot, A, we're not going to have an ambassador because Tom's stepping down. B, our bench is not that deep with the Palestinians. So how do we actually operationalize that and achieve something that brings the Palestinians into the equation? Do we do this by, with, and through diplomacy with our partners in the region, Jordan and others, at a time when Biden himself has prioritized the Ukraine war, obviously, China, anyone who's working on the Middle East right now? I mean, God bless them in the Biden administration, because they're fighting the fight for relevance versus these other issues.
They're keeping the lights on in the building. And I think that's as far as you can take it, because I think the way you put it is a very glass half full way of talking about the Biden administration's general approach to the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
And even when you hear them talk about Iran now, it's mainly in the context of them supplying drones to Russia to use in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And the Middle East just is not that much of a foreign policy priority for them as much as they want to say that it is.
Right.
And that's clear in word and in deed. So in terms of the Palestinians, I think the first thing you need to do is actually demonstrate that this is a priority for you, and not just trying to do your best to keep things from de-escalating further or to try to keep things on life support, but you actually need to take tangible forward-thinking action to moving things along and to creating some sort of equity, just like you said.
Yeah. So another topic in the last few weeks, you've reported on this. What's going on inside of Israel's politics and the crisis of their democracy? But then how does that interact back here? You've seen protests, and you were there in New York. There was incidents recently in Boston, I understand, and other places. What's going on there? And is this different from what we've seen before in terms of the divisions and what's been underneath the surface inside of Israel?
Yeah, so I think it depends on your vantage point. You know, either this is a new low for Israel, and this is as far right as it's ever been, or this is just revealing the true face that has always been there of this Israeli government. And the first thing they wanted to do was completely gut Israel's judiciary system. They wanted to completely erase any sense of checks and balances. They wanted to completely take away the independent judiciary. And Israelis are rising up like they have never risen up before. There have been 26 weeks now, I think, of just
protests,
unprecedented protests, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets every week. And this past week, I think it was 16 ministers and members of Netanyahu's coalition came to the Northeast Corridor for meetings with local Jewish leaders and to march in pro-Israel Day parades in New York City. And Israeli expats living here, Israelis from Tel Aviv and Israel that came over for the protests, American Jewish establishment leaders, progressive Jews, you name it. It's a whole coalition of people that are so against what this government is doing to Israel's democracy. And they're hounding them. They are not letting them sleep. They're not letting them have private meetings. They're not letting them make public appearances. They are just everywhere they go. And there has been a very aggressive pushback against that. 3 people canceled appearances. Other people are just going completely uninterrupted. They're flipping the bird to protesters on the street. The guy who's in charge of engaging the world's Jewish community for the Israeli government, Israel's diaspora affairs minister, he's flipping off protesters on the sidelines of the pro-Israel Day parade in New York.
Wow.
I mean, this is as bad of PR as you can get for the state of Israel if this is you. And what you saw today in Boston was the economy minister, Nir Barkat, who's one of Netanyahu's most important allies in the coalition, who's really sort of keeping this judicial reform alive. His security forces, I think they broke his leg. I don't think that's been confirmed yet, but he definitely went to the hospital and he was definitely pushed down violently by his security.
Yeah.
And this is the face of the Israeli government to the outside world.
Yeah. There's a lot of anger and there's a lot of division. And I mean, this is a country also that has been through successive elections over the last couple of years, a very unstable political system, but also social divisions and things like that. And Americans are quite familiar with that, right? And then I think when I go to places like Jordan or Saudi Arabia, or they look at both of these countries and see the sort of disarray. And it's not Syria, it's not Yemen, it's not a civil war, but it does introduce a higher degree of unpredictability than ever, I think, was witnessed before. And it leads a lot of people to think, how do we protect our interests here? Again, it's another complicating factor. The point I'm trying to say is that the instability in both of our political systems actually then makes it probably a little bit harder for us to achieve a meaningful diplomatic engagement that produces the results that people say they want. Israel, Saudi normalized relations and other things like this. Those divisions, I think, are quite shocking. And then I'm not Jewish. You are. You look at these fights within the Jewish American community, people going after George Soros and other things, which I think it becomes so visceral because it connects with people's personal identity and how they define not only their political beliefs, but in some cases their religious beliefs. And where does this all go when you look at, does this sort of take us to the edge and then cooler heads prevail and people step back? Or what's your prediction of where this goes in terms of Israel's politics and how it interacts with the Jewish American community?
I really don't know. I think this is a real, genuine inflection point for the future of the American Jewish community's relationship with the state of Israel, with how the state of Israel welcomes the world's Jewish community, with how the state of Israel engages with the world in general. This is a real marker in the road. We're at a real fork. And if it goes continue to pace, there's no telling what the future is going to hold. The United States cannot defend the state of Israel in world forums if it isn't a democracy, if it annexes the West Bank and becomes a de facto and a de jure apartheid state. There is no defending that. And Israel's democratic standing is the bedrock of the U.S.-Israel relationship. You have heard that time and time again from President Biden all the way down through his administration. At every given opportunity. Vice President Harris just said this the other day at the Israel Embassy's Independence Day party. And without that bedrock, there's no telling what's next. And, it's really interesting because you mentioned the similarities between what's going on within America with its democratic crisis and Israel's. Simcha Rotman, who's the lawmaker, who's the architect of this judicial overhaul, he was recently in Washington. He gate crashed the embassy party. That's a whole nother story. Go to Haaretz.com to read more. But, he confirmed meeting with one member of Congress during his time in Washington. Guess who it was? Jim Jordan.
Yeah.
I mean, what more do you need to know about the way they are viewing how to reform democracy in the way that best suits their own political interests?
So, but how do you see the different groups that then advocate on behalf of different factions lining up with all of this? It's AIPAC, J Street, but it's more than that, and there are different voices. How's that constellation changed? How does it serve U.S.-Israel interests? How does it disserve it? Like, there's more complexity there than it's ever been before.
And that's really kind of working itself out in real time. Yeah. I mean, you're seeing the finance minister of the Israeli coalition, Bezalel Smotrich, he came to Washington a few days after calling for a Palestinian village to be wiped off the map.
Right.
This is calling for ethnic cleansing by any other name. And there was a huge protest outside, and it was a coalition of anti-occupation protesters, pro-democracy protesters, American Jews who just were against whatever it was they were saying. And beyond the fact that they objected to his remarks, they really didn't agree on much else in terms of how they envisioned the future of the state of Israel. And you're really kind of seeing this manifest in real time, both between American Jews and Israelis that live on the ground here and Israelis that live over there relating to American Jews. They're just not really sure how to bridge those divides beyond the fact that they all want to see the preservation of Israel's democracy. And it's really something that they're trying to figure this out in real time as democracy is under threat. And they have a lot of work ahead of them.
So given this complicated picture inside of Israel's politics, and then what we talked about on the Republican and Democratic side, we've got an election coming up here. And clearly, I think most of the debate is going to be about us and the domestic issues, and is Biden too old, and all of this, and this sometimes superficial debate. But this will be a feature, the U.S.-Israel relationship, and some will want to make it a feature. There's a reason why I think Ron DeSantis, who's trying to get the GOP nomination, went to Israel in part of his global tour. Paint for me and paint for us the picture that you see in 2024 in terms of politics in America. What's your best estimate of how this plays out? You talked about how the Democratic Party will not have a leader like Joe Biden ever again that will have this view on Israel. You've got a Republican Party that has its own view. How does this play out, and does it matter in terms of the 2024 election from your vantage point?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to keep an eye on is the Republican primaries. And I think there's going to be a real concerted effort by the challengers to Donald Trump, who by any metric is the frontrunner. But there's going to be a real challenge from everyone to run to his right on Israel, which sounds like an impossibility, but Ron DeSantis is already doing it. And he's already saying that he had to cajole Donald Trump into moving the embassy to Jerusalem because he was waiting too long to do it, even though he only waited, however long he waited to actually do it.
Yeah.
And Mike Pence is featuring Bibi Netanyahu in his campaign launch video. And he is going to frame himself as someone who has always been a tried and true evangelical supporter of Israel, when Donald Trump just did it for his own political expediency. So there's going to be a real effort within the Republican nomination to sort of jump to the front of the lines in terms of their tried and true support of Israel.
So let's pause there. How does that interact with this fight for Israel's democracy? And if people are trying to project Israel in a certain way in the image in the intra-Republican party fight, does this affect things at all in terms of because on the one hand, democracy protesters are essentially saying, we've got to fight for something different. These guys who are going to go to the right of Trump are saying, Israel, we've just got to back them and that's it.
So the line that you're hearing publicly from the Republican Party is that it's not our place to tell Israel how to handle their internal affairs. What you're hearing privately is a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more concern, and this could endanger America's ability to support Israel against Iran or in international forums or whatever it may be. But what you're hearing publicly from Mitch McConnell on down is that we're minding our own business. And for the Biden administration and for Democratic lawmakers in unprecedented numbers to talk about how important it is to preserve Israel's democracy against whatever Netanyahu is trying to do, there's a real sort of divide there. So that's the Republican angle. In the general election, whoever gets the Republican nomination, it doesn't necessarily matter. They're going to paint Joe Biden as anti-Israel and for enabling anti-Israel forces within the Democratic Party. And I think the most important thing about the general election in terms of Israel is that the 10-year memorandum of understanding that gave Israel unprecedented military assistance
expires.
It expires. So whoever's going to be the next president is really going to determine the next 10, 20 years of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And this whole military aid is sacrosanct. That's going to come up for litigation with whoever becomes the next president and whoever controls the next session of Congress. So on one hand, it's going to be business as usual. People are going to talk about the unbreakable, unshakable bond, but in a way that has never really been on the ballot. It's going to be talking about the future of the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Is there a debate in Israel, including in the security establishment and other places, that we don't need this aid anymore, that we need cooperation but not aid? Meaning that we're an economic powerhouse, that we're confident in ourselves. Do you see that at all?
I don't. And I think you really saw it after the 2021 Gaza war, when they needed $1 billion in supplemental funding for the Iron Dome missile defense system. And, they get $3.8 billion a year, but they needed an extra $1 billion to replenish it, because what the Palestinian militant forces did this time around, rather than last time around, was they decided to do more quantity than quality. And they weren't necessarily trying to target where the actual missile launches were, but they were just trying to completely bombard and overload the Iron Dome.
So, but there was an effort and there was a vote to try to not fund that, right? And how did that go? And what's your take on that?
Well, that's really interesting, because the progressive objection to it was the fact that the Democratic leadership tried sneaking it into a completely unrelated package of legislation. They tried putting it in the omnibus without consulting with the progressive caucus.
But nobody understands that.
Exactly. So what you're hearing is progressives don't support military aid to Israel. And then, just the news cycle feeds itself.
Right.
Israeli media writes headlines saying the Democratic Party finally breaks up with Israel. And, they're objecting to congressional bureaucracy and the procession of it all.
Right.
And when it became separate legislation, that was a real moment for progressive lawmakers to really speak truth to power and to say, we are voting against this supplemental military aid. You're already getting billions and billions of dollars. We're drawing the line here.
How many?
So it was 8, but what I reported at the time was they were bracing for as many as 35 progressives to vote against this. And Democratic leadership, for 48 hours around the clock, they were whipping votes. And they said, we are getting this under 10 votes. That is the most important thing. We know we're not going to bat 1,000, but if we get it under 10 votes, then it's a win. And they got it under 10.
But back to what we talked about earlier, in the grand scheme of things, like whether it was 10 or whether it was 40 or even 50, how much does that matter? And does it change the equation?
In real time, not as much, but the drip of it all, it does matter. And I think, if the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh happened in 2008 rather than 2022, would senators at the highest level be pressing senior State Department officials about this incessantly? I don't think so.
Yeah.
What's happening now is completely different than what would have happened 10 years ago. And if you extrapolate that, what's going to happen 10 years from now, if Israel continues apace, who knows?
So that's all the time we have this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can find our latest coverage of regional developments on our website at www.mei.edu. And you can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Brian Katulis. We'll see you at the next episode.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.